What's really going on with the Pete Alonso situation? We are talking about that right here on the True Mets Talk podcast. All right, what's up, all you amazing Mets fans? It's your boy CP, and welcome back to the True Mets Talk podcast. Thank you for visiting the channel and taking some time out of your day to come talk about this Pete Alonso situation, this ongoing saga that myself and I'm sure this entire Mets fan base at this point just can't wait for a resolution to play itself out regardless of what route Pete Alonso decides to choose. Before we get into this video fully and kind of decipher some of the conflicting and contrasting reports that we've heard across the board, please do smash on that thumbs up button if you enjoy the content. And if you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And as always, comment your thoughts and opinions down below, because this isn't really a podcast episode that we're going to be talking about in relation to a report of a Mets potential trade or free agent target, right? I'm going to just be giving my 2 cents in terms of how I think this Pete Alonso situation is playing out right now and what we are looking at moving forward and potentially coming to that resolution. Now, just a forewarning, this is being recorded before our Mets Hot Stove Live that is going down at 5:30 p.m. on the channel. So if there is some overlap on this episode right here and what we talked about in that stream, I do apologize, but I had to talk about this as well in a standstill episode, especially when you take a look at these reports right here from Andy Martino. And we'll get into the differences in the actual tone and the outlook from basically 1 week to the next and what Andy Martino was reporting about Pete Alonso. But before we get into that, I know that the primary assumption that a lot of Mets fans in particular have, especially towards Andy Martino, is that there's a fair chance that either the New York Mets or Scott Boras is feeding Andy Martino and any other beat reporter information intentionally in order to get a high ground in these negotiations, right? This can be coming from either side at this point. And while I'm not ruling that out at all, I actually think that is a very good, and there's a very good chance of that being played out here. I also want to state that, Andy Martino, at the end of the day, when he chooses not to interject his opinions on the New York Mets and when he actually reports on the facts, there is a lot of good that can happen because he actually has gotten some stuff right going back to last offseason. So it's kind of important to decipher what's what, especially when he talks about the New York Mets. But I wanted to talk about these two differences in reports in particular here. And again, please feel free to let me know what you think in the comments section. And while we're trying to differentiate these two reports. So the first one, as you all have heard, Andy Martino basically stating that the Mets are pivoting to plan B and that Pete Alonso and the Blue Jays were actually around the 10-yard line, quote unquote, in their negotiations in terms of getting a deal done that sends Pete Alonso to Toronto. Now, Andy Martino was also very careful to follow that up and state that from experience, those last 10 yards can also have a lot of obstacles that could stop that progress from happening, from it going from the 10-yard line to essentially a touchdown and a done deal. And that was last week, right? It was a far gone conclusion. At this point, everybody ran with it. Tim Healy of Newsday also backed that sentiment up, kind of stating that there was a lot of steam picking up between the Blue Jays and Pete Alonso. Well, you fast forward here until just recently, I believe it was yesterday or, again, very recently, Andy Martino provides a different quote. And this is a complete 180 from that 10-yard line sentiment, right? In this bottom graphic right here on your screen, quote unquote from Andy Martino, there's no reason for the Mets to rush. The final Mets offer that Alonso turned down, which again, if you don't know, was for 3 years with opt-outs for around $68 to $70 million that also had some deferment. So the total value was probably north of $70 million, but the present day value without deferments was between $68 to $70 million. That's what he's referring to. that's going to be tough for him to beat with the Blue Jays. But hold on, wait, I thought just last week that those negotiations were at the 10-yard line. And $23.5 million of present day value, that's going to be tough to beat for the Blue Jays when they just signed Santander to a massive deal, right? Not really massive in the grand scheme of things, under $100 million, but with a lot of deferments, they have a lot of money at this point, present day money, to allocate towards Pete Alonso, right? You would think, and that's what we all would think, and I would think that. So what's really going on here? Because clearly there's a disconnect between Pete Alonso and the New York Mets still. But also at the same time, given that disconnect, Pete Alonso still seems to be holding out this hope that the Mets will come to their senses and meet him at least halfway in what he's proposing. Now, we don't know exactly what he's proposing because Boras is keeping very quiet, and all we know is that the New York Mets don't like what they're proposing because Steve Cohen at Amazing Day Fan Fest was very adamant about that. But again, what is the Blue Jays line of thinking here, and why, at this point, given the uncertainties with the New York Mets, why aren't they swooping in and getting this deal done? Why is Andy Martino now all of a sudden telling us that it's going to be hard for the Blue Jays to beat the offer that Alonso has turned down, and that's presumably still on the table to him from the New York Mets? Well, this goes back into the Vladimir Guerrero Jr. discussions and the timeline that he set to negotiate an extension over there in Toronto. This is where I'm kind of shifting my focus as a Mets fan and trying to assess if Pete Alonso is actually serious about coming back or whether he's waiting and holding out in this market for the Blue Jays to finish their negotiations with Vlad Jr. Because if Vlad Jr. is asking for $400+ million, which is what we've heard, clearly the Blue Jays aren't going to make the strongest of offers to Pete Alonso, especially not up front. Especially if they can't convince Vlad Guerrero Jr. to take deferments or massive deferments in that deal. It just wouldn't add up. And that's why I've been taking this sentiment personally. And I know Rob also has agreed with me in this sense that a world for the Blue Jays, at least, with Vlad Jr. and Pete Alonso on the same team, not even just situationally and positionally, but contractually, would be very difficult. And we're kind of seeing that at play right here. Now, on the other side of the fence, to be fair to Pete Alonso, he could very well be wanting to come back to the New York Mets. We've stated this time and time again, and it is my strong and humble opinion that the Mets are the best fit for Pete Alonso if he wants to go back out onto the market next offseason alongside Vlad Jr. if he doesn't sign that extension with Toronto and get his long-term deal. Because ultimately, if he's down to 3 years and willing to take the 3 years with an opt-out, that's presumably his end goal. And you also have other complications with the stipulations in these contracts that could be going on as well. We heard Evan Roberts in the report of an opt-out bonus that the Mets would have to pay. If Pete Alonso were to opt out, the Mets would actually owe him more money. And a lot of other people around this fan base, stated that Boras negotiated that similar clause in Bellinger's contract with the Chicago Cubs. To that, I say, Bellinger was already a former MVP at that point, and Pete Alonso was not. The New York Mets are already willing to give him an opt-out or at least multiple opt-outs worth of protection for him to either opt out and go seek that deal or opt in and take the money in the event that he doesn't perform up to expectations yet again. But you cannot have the best of both worlds. And maybe the Toronto Blue Jays at this point aren't budging on that clause as well. So a lot of different factors at play here, but there is growing sentiment that the Blue Jays are really going to try to prioritize this extension. And we're coming up on the date, February 18th, just around when spring training starts, is that cutoff. If they don't come to an agreement with Vlad Jr., Will they trade him and then prioritize Pete Alonso? Because everything that Andy Martino is stating and alluding to with this Pete Alonso situation is that it could play out going into spring training of him remaining a free agent and not signing with any team. Now, the main thing that throws me in for a loop here is where the Angels fit in, because I have no doubt in my mind that they probably would go above and beyond the extra mile to give him the AAV that he wants, the opt-outs, that he wants, and also maybe an extra year if that's what he's really seeking, right? But Pete Alonso doesn't want to go to the Angels. He knows that's not the best route for him, right? In terms of the success, in terms of going back out onto the market and having a strong 2025 campaign. And he also knows that nobody at that point would really take him seriously if he decided to walk and go to the Angels. No disrespect to that organization and no disrespect to their fans. But let's be honest, the way that they have been run for the better part of the last decade has not been great. Pete Alonso knows that. Scott Boras knows that. And at that point, if he takes that deal with the Angels, it was always about the money for Pete. And it still could be. It still could be. That could be his end goal. But the primary sentiment of this report right here that we saw last from Andy Martino, well, that means the Blue Jays aren't really committed to giving him the best offer as of right now. For whatever reason that is. Figuring out their roster, figuring out their trajectory, figuring out the Vlad Jr. extension, they are not beating the Mets offer at this point. So what reason do the Mets have, if they know that, to bid against themselves and go above and beyond just to give in to Pete Alonso's demands? There is zero incentive at this point to do that. Now, Mets fans, I know that patience is running thin. Quite frankly, I'm getting tired of coming on here and talking about it, but I do it because there's just so much to unpack here. And at the end of the day, it's a very important step to complete in knowing the trajectory, at least for the Mets in 2025. But we want a resolution soon. But given that, from the perspective of the Mets, David Stearns and Steve Cohen, they're also probably growing impatient. Steve Cohen was very transparent that these negotiations are exhausting, but they have to play the long game here, and they have to be financially responsible and not overpay when they don't need to. Mostly because people seem to forget that the New York Mets are already paying the highest luxury tax penalty, and they are approaching the threshold of paying the highest surcharge penalty that there is to offer from the CBA. But not only that, because maybe, just maybe, the New York Mets can get Boras and Pete Alonso to crack first. Let's say Pete Alonso gets tired of waiting, and he's just like, you know what, screw it. Let's take the Mets offer if the Blue Jays really aren't going to budge. Maybe they put the pressure back on Pete Alonso to make a rash decision, which would be great for the New York Mets. But at the end of the day, if a better Blue Jays offer does come across the table, the Mets are always going to have that opportunity to match it or go above and beyond to retain Pete Alonso. And they know that, which is also partly the reason I could assume that they are in no rush to make a stronger offer than what they just did in what Pete Alonso declined. So let me know, Mets fans. Again, a lot to unpack here. Let me know from your perspective what you think about these negotiations. How do the Angels get themselves involved? What does this look like to you in terms of the Blue Jays front? Subscribe to the channel. And as always, hit on that like button. It's your boy CP. It's the True Mets Talk podcast. Until next time, peace.